We just went through a devastating financial crisis less than a decade ago because powerful people in government let powerful financial institutions call the shots. We can't go down that road again. We need people in government who are willing to stand up to large financial institutions, and we need people who have a demonstrated history of that. And you simply don't, Mr. Quarles. You've got 15 years representing big banks at a New York law firm, working on some of the mergers that created the too big to fail banks that we have today. You have 2 stints at the Treasury Department, including shortly before the 2008 crisis, where you insisted that the banks were well capitalized enough to survive a housing downturn. Turns out they weren't. And more than a decade in private equity and investment management, where you've argued repeatedly for weaker rules for the biggest banks. So that's not a track record that should give Americans a whole lot of confidence in you. But what I want to do is try to look ahead on this. The big banks and financial firms have a lobbying organization called the Financial Services Roundtable, or FSR, and it has no community bank members. It's purely the big guys. FSR recently submitted a 124-page wish list of financial rule rollbacks for the Treasury Department. So I want to go through some of these and see how your views line up with the views of the big banks. So first one here, FSR would like to see the stress test relaxed for the Fed and give its stress test models to the banks before the actual test. They want to see the test ahead of time. Do you support those changes?
Well, not having read the FSR's report, I don't know all of the
Wait,
details
let me get this straight. You've been nominated to be the head of Fed Supervision, and you haven't read this from the FSR?
I have not read that report.
Okay, so we'll ask the question then more generally. Do you think that stress test standards need to be relaxed and the banks need to see them in advance?
I think that transparency around the content of the test with the public in general, which would include the regulated entities.
So they ought to be able to see the tests in advance?
I believe that that
And
would
you think they ought to be relaxed?
Of regulation. I don't have a view as to whether they ought to be relaxed, in part because I am not, because of the lack of transparency, I'm not perfectly familiar with all of the content of the test.
Okay, so you think they ought to see the test in advance is just what they're asking for, and you don't have an opinion on whether or not they ought to be weakened. How about capital? FSR would like a bunch of changes to the calculation of how capital and leverage requirements that would have the effect of lowering, all of which would have the effect of lowering these standards. Do you believe that capital and leverage standards should be lowered?
I don't have a view as to whether they should be higher or lower. I do think that more can be done to ensure that in setting the capital for the full range of institutions in the system, that we can be more sensitive to the character of each institution in determining.
So you think it should be lowered for some but raised for others?
Again, in advance of the analysis, I couldn't tell you.
So you don't have an opinion on that. What about the Volcker Rule, which prohibits the banks from making risky bets with their own money? FSR wants to cut the rule back so that the banks can make more of those kinds of investments. Do you agree with FSR that the Volcker Rule should be cut back so that it should place fewer restrictions on the banks?
I agree with former Governor Tarullo that the complexity of the rule makes it very difficult to apply and that we should work to try to simplify.
Well, now that's easy. If you just want to simplify it, you'd support Glass-Steagall, right? Do you support Glass-Steagall?
Well, as you know, Senator, the key provisions of Glass-Steagall are still in force, which are Section 16 and 21 of the Banking Act.
No, the key provisions of Glass-Steagall are not enforced anymore. They've been repealed.
No, the ancillary provisions, which are Section 20 and 32.
Which are the ones which permit the big banks to be able to engage in these combined activities that Glass-Steagall were supposed to separate. That's what's now permitted.
Well, the core provisions actually prevent the bank from engaging in that. So Section 16 and 21.
Do you think we're perfectly protected if we took away Volcker? Is that what you're saying, and we don't need Glass-Steagall?
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the first part of the question.
You're saying we're protected if we took away Volcker and didn't put Glass-Steagall in its place? That's why nothing went wrong in 2008?
Well, I don't think that the reimposition of the ancillary provisions governing affiliates, which are sections 20 and 32, would in fact have made a difference in the financial crisis. But usually when people are talking about today about the reimposition of Glass-Steagall, they're talking about ensuring that the depository institution is protected from risks in other part of a large financial institution.
You know,
I think that's a very worthy goal.
I'm over my time, and so I want to be respectful here. But I'm just looking for any area where you disagree with the major financial institutions, and I'm not hearing it. The primary purpose of this job is to be able to stand up to the largest financial institutions in this country. You have no history of having done that, and sitting here right now, all you can say is, gee, I haven't thought about that. We just went through a devastating financial crisis less than a decade ago because powerful people in government let powerful financial institutions call the shots. We can't go down that road again. We need people in government who are willing to stand up to large financial institutions, and we need people who have a demonstrated history of that. And you simply don't, Mr. Quarles. Thank you. I apologize for running over, Mr. Chair.